Now we're going to try to move ahead to the next section of the neurophysiology notes to what is happening at the postsynaptic neuron. And so we're looking at neurotransmission. And remember when I said something about a PSP, stands for postsynaptic potential? We're going to be looking at that now. So I want to, before I do that, I want to really bring your attention to this particular link that I put up for you. It's right at the top of this particular lecture. I'll try to post it. I found it after I already posted the other lecture notes, but this is like a great little resource. It's free and it goes through, you can see neurotransmission and postsynaptic potential. And here's the table of contents. You go down, you can see summation, but also applied clinical psychology. It's not a huge, big, in-depth thing, but it shows you some little basics that are definitely valuable nuggets for you in a very short, small space for free. So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out to you. And then we will go back to our lecture notes. Now, I have made a few more revisions. You can't leave me alone with notes without me revising some that I think made it a little bit better, but mostly it's like what you probably have for your partial notes that are uploaded now on D2L. At any rate, this will be up later today, which is Wednesday. Okay, so let's take a look at the actions of neurotransmitters on that postsynaptic membrane. Remember, postsynaptic is here, this is where the neurotransmitter molecules are being released, and then this is the postsynaptic cell. And so this is the membrane here. And the actions of these really depend on the structure of the neurotransmitter and of the receptor in question. So it's not like a simple, this neurotransmitter always does exactly this, and this is the only kind of receptor it interacts with. It's much more complex than that. But the bottom line is the effects include postsynaptic depolarization. If something is depolarized, remember how we did the action potential? That action potential is caused because of the depolarization of that particular cell. And we call that excitatory postsynaptic potential, and that's where we get EPSP. Remember, both of these can be considered PSPs, but this one is E for excitatory. And in a moment, we're going to see there's inhibitory as well. So this will decrease the resting membrane potential. Remember, bringing it up closer so that there's less of a difference to the outside of the cell, which will increase the chance that the neuron will fire. Postsynaptic hyperpolarization, that means to make more different, more than normally different. This is going to increase the resting membrane potential. Remember when I talked about how once it goes down super, super low, like in terms of looking at the graph, like -90, -90, that makes a huge difference in polarity between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. If we do that, that is going to make it hard for that neuron to fire. It will decrease the chance that the neuron will fire. Both of these are what we call graded responses. Now, remember when I talked about the action potential, I said it's all or none. Bam, once it goes with the same strength all the way down. It's not a little bit of an action potential or a huge action potential. It is an action potential. That is different from what we're going to see with these postsynaptic potentials. Here we go, we have the amplitude of both of these types of postsynaptic potentials are proportional to the intensity of the signals that elicit them. They travel passively, okay, that's important, from the site of their generation. There is no regeneration. They don't get booster shots on their way to the axon hillock. And herein lies one of the really important facts. That synapses near the axon hillock, remember where the axon hillock is, right here. These synapses closer to that are actually going to have a bigger effect, okay? The most influence, we should say. And these are fast, but they're decremental. These postsynaptic potentials are fast, but they weaken over time, which is not like the action potential, which does not weaken. So, all right, let's say we have a bunch, which we will have a lot of different synapses on this particular cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. So how does it decide whether to fire or whether to, like, oh no, I need to be quiet? Well, we're going to integrate that information we're getting from all of the postsynaptic potentials. If you have a postsynaptic potential just at one synapse, that's going to have little effect on the firing of the postsynaptic neuron. And ultimately, whether that neuron fires or not depends on the balance between inhibitory, don't fire, and excitatory, fire, 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 signals reaching that axon hillock. If the sum of the depolarizations and hyperpolarizations reach the axon hillock at any time, enough at the same time, that will be considered a threshold of excitation if it is sufficient to depolarize the membrane to a level where we can generate an action potential. Let me go through that last point once more, and I'm going to read it exactly the way I have it written in here. If the sum of depolarizations, excitatory, postsynaptic potentials, and hyperpolarizations, inhibitory, postsynaptic potentials, reaching the axon hillock at any time is sufficient to depolarize the membrane to a level referred to as a threshold of excitation, minus 65, minus 55, I should say negative, that's really more appropriate, negative 65 or negative 55 millivolts, and action potential is generated. Boom, remember those sodium channels at the junction will change configuration, open up, and allow sodium ions to rush in to the axon. Now, this integration can be done in a couple of different ways. First off, we can have spatial integration. So if we have local EPSPs produced simultaneously on different parts of the membrane, you'll get a greater EPSP. In other words, let's say, how can I do this? Okay, maybe I'll do it this way. Here are a lot of different synapses. Synapsing, can you see this? On this cell body, or let's say cell body for now, and dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. So here are all of these different synapses. If they all at once, okay, activate, if they're produced simultaneously, that will form a greater EPSP, okay? And if that's the case, it's more likely that the neuron will fire. Now, local IPSPs produced simultaneously on different parts of the membrane form a greater IPSP, which means reduces the likelihood of that neuron firing. So here we go. It's like now these are inhibitory, and they're going here, and all at once, they are going to be produced simultaneous. Quiet down, okay? That's essentially quiet down. So now you have that idea that the more signals that happen at the same time, postsynaptically, the more likely the neuron will respond to that, either by firing, if it's EPSP, or by staying quiet and not firing, if it's an IPSP. That is spatial integration. But there's also temporal integration. This is the case where potential is produced in rapid succession at the same synapse, sum together to form a greater signal. So, okay, say that is, I'm being a neuron, and those are signals being, fast. Okay, and this is the same synapse. Now I'm going to stay at that same synapse and go, do. Now we have slower, signals, slower signaling. And so that is going to be less likely to stimulate the neuron. So one important thing is that the postsynaptic potentials can outlast the initial stimulation. In other words, you can have some potentials. Here we go, potential, all here, put it back here by my face. And now they're still there, and they're traveling. And now let's add another stimulation. This second stimulation is going to have more of an effect because it's getting together. It's moving towards the hillock now, and it's summing up with the one that was already there. I always think of it like this, and trust me, this is not the same thing, but I think the concept is. Did you ever hurt yourself and get a bruise there, arm, leg, wherever? Okay, so you take a hit somewhere, you look, and within a few hours you see a bruise. All you have to do is touch that, right? And it hurts. I mean, you can feel it's different. Well, now poke that again. That poke on that bruise is going to cause you to go, ow, where you might not otherwise have exclaimed out in pain. My dog just thought that there's a problem because I yelled, ow, and he's used to me doing things that can hurt. So he's being very alert right now. Anyway, I digress. So now we have these neurotransmitter molecules floating around here in the synapse, okay? And moving up here and moving down here and all that extracellular fluid. Now, we don't want them to stay out there forever for a bunch of reasons, okay? Not the least of which is if you have excitatory neurotransmitter molecules out there for too long, you can end up doing, doing damage ultimately, having hyperexcitability. So we also want to reuse the components of these neurotransmitter molecules. Our body is the coolest recycling machine ever. And so how are we going to get these molecules out of the synapse? Two ways. First way, reuptake. This is the more common way according to some sources. The bottom line is though, you have little elevators. I call them little elevators, transporters. Here, okay, here are the vesicles, neurotransmitter molecules. They're being released into the synapse. Now we've got a little transporter that will grab them and take them back up into the same neuron from which they were released. Then they're going to be repackaged in vesicles by those Golgi complex that are hanging out down at the terminal and sit around and wait until they are released again. So they'll be re-released. Very, very efficient type of action. The second way that we're going to clear that synapse is through enzymatic degradation. Enzymes. I actually put the definition for enzymes here so that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. Chemicals that stimulate or inhibit chemical reactions. So they can alter chemical reactions without directly participating in them, okay? Many of the breakdown products of enzymatic degradation are reabsorbed, again, recycling, by the presynaptic button and used in the synthesis of more molecules of neurotransmitter. Love it. So, you know, really being conscientious little guys, okay? So, degradation means to break down or to break apart. So this simply means that neurotransmitters are broken apart in the synapse by enzymes, and there are different enzymes for different neurotransmitters. What I did here was I just showed like starting how we can go through pathways of breakdowns. This is dopamine. You might want to come back and refer to this. It'll probably come up later on when we start talking more about disorders that involve issues with dopamine, which are numerous. This one is beautifully simple. Love it. Acetylcholine is actually most frequently inactivated by enzymatic degradation. And I love it. If I ruled the world, everything would be named like this. Acetylcholine. There is an enzyme. See that ASE at the end? That's an enzyme. It means it's an enzyme. Acetylcholine. Oh, I pretty much love that because it's the name of this esterase. That will then break acetylcholine into acetyl and choline. Love it. Simple. Makes sense. Okay, so you need to know those two things, reuptake and enzymatic degradation. Now, I want you to think a little bit about what is going on in that presynaptic cell, that membrane. The membrane of the neuron that's releasing the neuron. Remember, that's presynaptic. Remember what's happening? We have, and this is when I really wish I was in the classroom with you, because I have a way of demonstrating this that people tend not to forget. But not there, we're going to do it this way. Hopefully this will help you see it. So here are the vesicles, oops, and it's fusing with that cell membrane. Okay, do you see how now that little thing's gone, how it's fusing right in and becoming one? Well, why on earth then doesn't this cell membrane that's going around become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and wider and wider and wider? Think about having 5 people in a circle, everybody holding hands. Now you have one new person come in, grab a hand on one person and the hand of another person and join the circle. What happens to that circle? It gets bigger, right? So let's say, you know, that's what this person has to do, because by joining hands, it's releasing all of the contents of whatever happy neurotransmitters or whatever into the middle of the cell. Okay, so now joins hands, but that circle gets bigger. Why does this not happen to the actual terminal button? Because again, We are awesome recycling machines, recycling. Bits of that bouton membrane that are near the axon boundary. So where the axon comes down and then swells out to be the terminal or button, pieces of the membrane right there will break off and are recycled by Golgi complex, bet you knew that, into small synaptic vesicles. It's very, very efficient. So let's go on now to altering the effects of neurotransmitters. There are ways that we can do that, and this is absolutely critical for us to know, because when we talk about the various mental disorders, which is coming up sooner than you might think, the way time is going, we'll be talking about drugs that will work to either increase a neurotransmitter availability or decrease it, okay? So the first thing, agonist, that is an agent, It is the chemical or something that will increase the effects of a neurotransmitter. It can do this in a variety of ways. It doesn't always do it in exactly the same way. So let's think about the different ways. I was just checking, make sure I'm recording here, because I would hate to think I've done this whole thing without recording it. Anyway, panic. Anyway, it can increase the release of the neurotransmitter. It can mimic the effects of the neurotransmitter, can go in and be close enough to the neurotransmitter that the neuron goes, oh, I know you. It can delay the degradation so that enzymes can't break that neurotransmitter down as rapidly. Or it can serve to block reuptake. It can jump on those little transporters, those little elevators, jump in there and go, no, not getting in here. No, you're not going up. So those neurotransmitter molecules that might otherwise already have jumped up into that little transporter and moved back up into the cell have to hang out in the synapse longer. The other thing we can do is decrease the effect of a neurotransmitter with an antagonist, and that will decrease the release. Generally, what we're seeing is blocking receptors without activation of neurons. So there's many ways that we can do that. I'm going to just stop for a moment. And I am recording. I just had to convince myself that I was. Sometimes that happens, and I am, so we're good. And I'm going to go back to where we picked up. Thank you for putting up with me here. So going over here, we have different forms of synapses. They're not all the same. So often you see this textbook synapse that shows up, and it's like, oh, here's a neuron, and here's the axon, and here's the synapse at another neuron. Well, there are different kinds. I've tried to give you some illustrations here. There's axodendritic. That means the axon is going to synapse on dendrites of another neuron. See, right here. Okay. There's axosomatic, exactly what it sounds like. From the axon, we see a synapse on the actual soma or cell body. Dendrodendritic, dendrite can actually synapse on a dendrite of another neuron, or axonal. And this is a really interesting mechanism, because with an axonal, basically what you have is you have a synapse on the neuron. It actually synapses back on the neuron, so it will activate that and decrease the release of a neuron. I will come back to that in a future lecture when we're talking about the medications a little bit more, the effects of agonists and antagonists. But for now, just try to have that picture. And if there's questions, I can answer those for you when we get together. Okay. There's two different types too of this release, or how the site is set up. We think very often of that typical textbook neuron, axon comes down, terminal button releases neurotransmitter right here. But that is only one of a couple kinds of release of neurotransmitter. That is directed. And that is when the site of neurotransmitter release is very near the reception. Okay? But there's also another form. It's called non-directed. And the site of release is distant and more diffuse. This is known as volume transmission. And it's kind of like little leaks in a hose. I actually found some of these pictures to demonstrate that in a couple ways. So pretend this is an axon and this is neurotransmitter release molecules. These are molecules. It could be like that. Here's another one. This is a handy way to actually water sometimes. And let's get you down here. You can see these little holes in the hose. So ultimately, you're not going to have as much neurotransmitter release at the terminal button, but you're going to be releasing neurotransmitter molecules in a very diffuse, wider area within the cytoplasm. The extracellular fluid, back me up. So this is the whole thing here. We have to remember these are postsynaptic potentials, are the effects of neurotransmitter release on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and remember, going back, action potentials are all or none. Not true about PSPs, postsynaptic potentials. They are graded. You can have stronger ones, you can have weaker ones. And remember about the way that we can have sites of release that are different from one another, directed and non-directed. I believe that is the end of this particular section of the neurophysiology. Again, it's definitely a very short crash course with the minimum of going into detail, but hopefully enough detail that when we start talking about, medication and how it's working to treat a particular condition, or when we're talking about overactivity of neurons in a particular brain region, or not enough activity, that it will make more sense and you'll be able to visualize it a little better. I hope that's part of my goal. So that's it for this. I will be next talking about those neurotransmitters and their systems, and we will then be wrapping up this portion of the course and getting ready to move on to just what we all want in mental disorders. Okay, thanks.